this presentation is going to be on the brainstem, and then I'm going to do the trigeminal system and the auditory pathway in another presentation. So again, I'm going to break this PowerPoint up into two portions. Let's first look at the brainstem, and here we are looking at the ventral aspect of the brainstem. Now before we go into that, let's see what are the structures that make up the brainstem. So the structures from above downwards are the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla oblongata. Now these three structures have within them a cavity which runs through, and if you remember, in the midbrain the cavity was the cerebral aqueduct, and within the pons and the medulla the cavity is the fourth ventricle. So the pons and the medulla form the floor of the fourth ventricle, and then the fourth ventricle is roofed over by the cerebellum. So again, to show you this, so if we looked at the cerebral, so we had the two lateral ventricles and they opened into the third ventricle. This third ventricle narrowed and became the cerebral aqueduct, and now this aqueduct actually flares out and becomes the fourth ventricle, which comes down and is the central canal of the spinal cord. So this aqueduct is surrounded by the midbrain. So here we have the midbrain which surrounds the aqueduct, and this region of the fourth ventricle has the pons and the medulla in its floor, and then sitting on the roof is the cerebellum in that fashion. So the roof the roof is formed by the cerebellum. So now let's look at what we see in this aspect, in the ventral aspect of the brain. We are not able to see the entire midbrain. We are only able to see a small part which I've shown you by the arrow. So this portion here, we're only able to see this part here, and this part is known as the crus cerebri. So on the ventral aspect, we only see the crus cerebri of the midbrain. Below that, you can see here, we see the pons, and notice how the pons looks on its ventral aspect. It's got ridges which travel across, and in the center is a sulcus that we see, and that sulcus present in the center lodges the basilar artery. The basilar artery and vein, so basilar blood vessels. Below the pons we have the medulla, and on the ventral aspect in the midline again you can see a fissure. On either side we have the presence of two swellings, and these are known as the pyramids. So this is that pyramid of one side and this is the pyramid of the other side. So these are the pyramids. Next to the pyramid you have another swelling which doesn't extend all the way down. So just so that you can see it, so it doesn't extend all the way down, stops short over here, stops short at this point. This swelling is known as the olive. It's called the olive because there's a nucleus by that name beneath it. So this is the olive of this side, and here is the olive of the other side. Then lateral to the olive, we have an area of nervous tissue which connects the medulla to the cerebellum. So you can see this is the cerebellum. So we have this area of nervous tissue which connects the medulla to the cerebellum, and that is known as the inferior cerebellar peduncle. And that is this portion here. So on this side, that inferior cerebellar peduncle is this lateral portion here. So from medial to lateral side, we have the pyramid, the olive, and the inferior cerebellar peduncle up here. Now what you also notice in this aspect, on the ventral aspect, is you notice a number of nerves. Most of the cranial nerves arise from the brainstem, except for the first and second. The first, which is the olfactory, that arises from the forebrain, which consists of the cerebral hemispheres, as does the second. So they are forebrain structures, whereas the third to the 12th, they arise from any part of the brainstem, with the third and the fourth arising from the midbrain, the fifth, sixth, and seventh, and eighth. They either arise from the pons or the junction between the pons and the medulla, and we'll see these further as we go along. And then the 9th, 10th, 11th, and 12th arise from the medulla. So you can see that they are arising from some part of the brainstem. So for you, it is important to know and see where these nerves are. So you can see the second cranial nerve. This part is the optic nerve. The two optic nerves join together and form a structure which is called the chiasma, and then that structure divides and forms the optic tract. So this arose from the forebrain. Now let's look at those which arise from the brainstem. This is the third cranial nerve, which you can see is medial to the crus. So this is the crus. This is the third cranial nerve, which is medial to the crus. And the fourth cranial nerve, this thin, slender nerve, this one on this side, this fourth cranial nerve is lateral to the crus cerebri. These two, the third and the fourth, are related to the midbrain. Then we have the fifth, which is the largest nerve. So this very thick nerve arises from the pons. So it has its nucleus inside the pons. Then at the pontomedullary junction, you can see from medial to lateral, you have the 6th, 7th, and the 8th cranial nerves. So 6th, 7th, and 8th cranial nerves. Then at the junction between the inferior cerebellar peduncle and the olive. So at the junction between the inferior cerebellar peduncle and the olive. So if I was to draw the medulla, and let's say that's the pons, and this is the pyramid, and this is the olive, and then this is the inferior cerebellar peduncle, this way. So at this junction between the inferior cerebellar peduncle and the olive, from below, we have the origin of the 11th. So we have these rootlets which come out. So that's the 11th. Then above, we have the 10th. And then further above, we have the 9th. So here is your 9th, 10th, and 11th. And notice these up here. So if you look up here, you can see the 9th up here between the olive and the inferior cerebellar peduncle. The 10th lower, just below, inferior to the 9th. And the 11th, this is called the cranial part of the accessory, is the lowest. Then between the pyramid and the olive, you can see these rootlets up here. These are the rootlets of the 12th cranial nerve. So between the pyramid and the olive, so I'll draw it on this side. So between the pyramid and the olive, these rootlets which come out, those are of the 12th or hypoglossal nerve. So this order you must know, and you can see that the 12th cranial nerve is more medial, whereas the 9th, 10th, and 11th are more lateral. And this is important for you to remember when you take sections. Now, when we take sections of the brain, then this is only showing you the ventral aspect. And here you can see, a cross-section of the spinal cord. So as the spinal cord has a ventral aspect here and a dorsal aspect, similarly, the brainstem also will have a ventral and a dorsal aspect. So when we take sections, you'll see the whole, you'll see both parts in it. Now let's look at the next image, which shows you the brainstem in a little more detail, and you can see the crus cerebri clearly here. So all the other parts have been removed. So here, look, this is the part. This is the brainstem. And what you notice here is that you can see the crus cerebri very clearly. So this forms part of the midbrain. This is the ventral aspect you're seeing, where all the cerebral hemisphere has been removed. This is the optic nerve. This is the chiasma, and this here is the optic tract. So you can see how the tract is winding around the crus. This medial nerve is the third, and there'll be a nerve which will come out laterally like that. That will be this one here will be the fourth cranial nerve. Here you can see the fifth. They haven't shown the sixth here, but the sixth arises at some point here. Then we have the seventh and the eighth, the ninth, rootlets of the ninth, 10th, and 11th laterally, and then the 12th more medially. So this shows you that's how those nerves would come out. Now here, as I said, this was the crus cerebri on the ventral aspect. This is the pons, and these are transverse ridges which you see in the pons, and this is the median sulcus of the pons, which lodges the basilar artery. In the medulla, notice the pyramids closer to the midline. Then we see the olive laterally, and further laterally we see the inferior cerebellar peduncle. Now what are these peduncles? A peduncle is really a band of white matter. These peduncles basically are bridges or pathways which connect the brainstem to the cerebellum. So let me show that to you in this. So imagine you have the brainstem. So we had the crus cerebri here. So this was the crus cerebri. This was the pons. And then this was the medulla. Now this is the fifth cranial nerve which came out of the pons. Now these three parts, the midbrain, the pons, and the medulla, these are connected to the cerebellum, and let me draw the cerebellum here. So they're connected to the cerebellum by bands of white matter which are known as peduncles. From the midbrain, you really can't see it well on this aspect, but I'm just going to draw it in dotted lines. From the midbrain, a band of white matter connects it to the cerebellum. From the pons, this band connects it to the cerebellum, and from the medulla, this one connects it to the cerebellum. So these are known as peduncles. The one which connects the midbrain to the cerebellum is known as the superior cerebellar peduncle. The one which connects the midbrain to the cerebellum, the pons to the cerebellum is known as the middle cerebellar peduncle. So the midbrain to the cerebellum is superior, the pons to the cerebellum is middle, and the medulla to the cerebellum is inferior cerebellar peduncle. So they are there on both sides. And the idea is that because the brainstem has so many cranial nerves, and we have a lot of sensory pathways too, so there is an interconnection between the cerebellum and different parts of the brainstem so that muscle coordination can occur properly and information can be given to the cerebellum and can be received from the cerebellum. So that's the purpose of having these peduncles which connect them. Now let's go back to our PowerPoint and let's look at the dorsal aspect. So if we were to turn this around and look at the back, so now we are looking at the back or the posterior or dorsal aspect, here's what we see in the dorsal aspect of the brainstem. So this is the thalamus and this is the thalamus, and here you can see the thalamus on the dorsal aspect. So let me go from the midbrain. Now in the midbrain, on the dorsal aspect, you see four bulges. So there are two below and two superiorly. These huge protuberances are known as colliculi, and there are two inferior and two superior colliculi, and together they're also known as corpora quadrigemina. Quadri you can see for four, quadrigemina. So you might see this name somewhere, and it is just telling you these are the superior and inferior colliculi. This is part of the crus cerebri. This area is part of the crus cerebri. So you can see this crus, this is the lateral aspect, and then when you turn around, you can see it posteriorly. So the crus cerebri. So you see the superior colliculus and the inferior colliculus. And just above them, this little structure which you are looking at, that's the pineal gland. That's not part of the midbrain. It's only the colliculi and the crus cerebri. Now this crus, this midbrain is connected to the cerebellum. If you remember, I told you by the superior cerebellar peduncle. So here you see the superior cerebellar peduncle. You can't see it on the ventral aspect. Then we are looking at the pons. So let me clear that. Now we're looking at the pons. So now we turn this around and let's look at the posterior aspect of the pons. So in the pons, here you can see this is the middle cerebellar peduncle. And then we see the fourth ventricle, and I'll just go over this. So here we are really looking at the opened out fourth ventricle, and we are looking at the floor of the fourth ventricle. So this whole structure is the fourth ventricle. And here we're looking at the floor of the fourth ventricle. So if I was to divide the fourth ventricle like this, the upper part of the floor is formed by the pons, and the lower part of the floor of the fourth ventricle is formed by the medulla. So now in the pons, what we see is, we'll see on the posterior aspect, we see a median sulcus, and then on either side, what is most noticeable is you see this little swelling present. That swelling is known as the facial colliculus, and then we'll see the significance of that facial colliculus. So this is what is seen in the pons on the dorsal aspect. Let's look at the medulla on the dorsal aspect. So on the dorsal aspect, when you look at the medulla, just like in front, again you have little, projections, but now on the posterior aspect, these projections are on top. They are known as, the medial one is called gracile tubercle, and the lateral one is called cuneate tubercle. And they are basically formed because there's a nucleus lying under it, or a collection of gray matter. Under the gracile tubercle will be the nucleus gracilis. Under the cuneate tubercle will be the nucleus cuneatus. And below, the projection is really formed by the tract which lies there. So this one here would be the fasciculus gracilis under this projection, and here would be fasciculus cuneatus. So medially you have fasciculus gracilis, laterally you have fasciculus cuneatus, and then further laterally you have it's continuous with the inferior cerebellar peduncle, so this area. So you take the lateral most and you go up, that's the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So if I was to kind of go around the medulla this way, I would have let me say I take a cross section. So I have the pyramid. So if I take a section at this part, let's say, then I have the olive, and then the inferior cerebellar peduncle, and then I will say the fasciculus cuneatus, fasciculus gracilis, cuneatus, and inferior cerebellar peduncle. So you see how that's been cut. Now one thing to remember is that if you look from the spinal cord, so let me use my page again, and let me take a new page. So let's say that we took the spinal cord. So here's the spinal cord. So let me draw the spinal cord this way. And you remember the central canal was pretty much in the center. and then we have the gray matter which surrounded this central canal in this fashion. Now, as we go up towards the medulla, what we notice it, so let's say that we've reached the medulla up here. So here we have the pyramid, the olive, the inferior cerebellar peduncle. So we have the pyramid, the olive, the inferior cerebellar peduncle, cuneate fascicle, gracilis, cuneate, and so on. This central canal travels in, but now the central canal, instead of being right in the middle, it kind of goes posteriorly. So now the central canal is going further posteriorly. As we go further up, what happens is that this central canal actually goes further back and it really opens out into the fourth ventricle. So if you remember, when I was drawing that and I told you that this was the cerebral aqueduct, and this aqueduct flared out and became the fourth ventricle, and then that fourth ventricle was continuous with the central canal of the spinal cord. So what happens is that this central canal is in the center of the spinal cord. So, we can draw the spinal cord like this. So this is in the center of the spinal cord. But when we reach the upper part of the medulla and the pons, this fourth ventricle has pretty much gone towards the posterior aspect. So it kind of opens out and you have very little nervous tissue present up here. That is why the floor of the fourth ventricle is formed by the pons and the upper part of the medulla. It's only in the lower part of the medulla that the central canal is present. And then this again becomes central. So when we reach the midbrain, again the central canal is in the center of the midbrain. So if you look at this PowerPoint and you look up here, so you notice that in the case of the midbrain, you can see a dorsal aspect of the midbrain and you can see a ventral aspect of the midbrain. If you look at the pons, you see the ventral aspect of the pons, but when you look at the dorsal aspect, what you're really seeing is that you're seeing the pons forming the floor of the fourth ventricle. There's hardly any nervous tissue behind this cavity because the only nervous tissue which is present is very little. It just goes up like this. And that's what will form the roof of the fourth ventricle this way, and then the cerebellum will be sitting on top of it here. So therefore it's the fourth ventricle that you're seeing, and the pons and the medulla form the floor of the fourth ventricle. Then when you come to the medulla, so you can see that the upper half of the medulla is forming the floor of the fourth ventricle, whereas the lower half actually has the central canal, because the floor of the fourth ventricle now becomes the central canal of the medulla, and then the central canal leads into the central canal of the spinal cord. To further explain for those who haven't understood, let me draw this in a side view. So again, in the side view, if I was to draw it, let me say that this is the cerebral aqueduct. This cerebral aqueduct now becomes the fourth ventricle this way, and then the fourth ventricle now becomes the central canal, and then it goes down. So this is a lateral view. So if I was to say that this is the ventral or anterior aspect and this is the dorsal or posterior aspect, I will draw the midbrain up here. So that's the midbrain, let's say the crus. This part here is the pons, and this part here is the medulla, this way. So that's the midbrain, pons, and medulla. And let me say that this was the cavity, the cerebral aqueduct, and fourth ventricle, and then down here is the central canal. Now, so this is the ventral aspect. On the dorsal aspect, in the case of the midbrain, you see nervous tissue, the superior and inferior colliculus. In the case of the pons, you don't see much nervous tissue, just see a thin film of nervous tissue. And then in the case of the medulla, So I'm just going to draw it like this, thin film of nervous tissue. In the case of the medulla, in the top part of the medulla, again a thin film of nervous tissue. And then in the lower part of the medulla, now you have the gracilis, fasciculus, depending on where your section is cut. And then this becomes the spinal cord. So can you see that, and this is the central canal of the spinal cord. So can you see in the case of the midbrain, the cavity is in the center. In the case of the lower part of the medulla, and let's say this was spinal cord, the case of the lower part of the medulla and the spinal cord, again the cavity is in the center. But in the case of the upper part of the medulla and in the pons, the cavity kind of pretty much occupies from, let's say the middle to the back, it occupies all that area. So there's very little nervous tissue. So it's almost like as the cavity is going up, it flares out and then becomes narrow again. And sitting here is the cerebellum. So this is the cerebellum. So that's why we say if this is the fourth ventricle and we look at the fourth ventricle from the top, we're looking at it from here. This part here will be the floor of the fourth ventricle. And this part here will be the roof of the fourth ventricle. So this here is the roof of the fourth ventricle. And this is the cerebellum. So the floor of the fourth ventricle is formed by the pons and the medulla, and the roof is formed by the cerebellum. So in that image which we were looking at, which is this image here, which is this image here, what we've done is basically we've removed the cerebellum which is sitting on top, and we've removed the nervous tissue, and so we can now glance into the floor. So what we've done here is that we've removed all of this. So if I was to remove all of this, and I was to open this up like this, now what I can see is I'm actually peeping into the floor. So I can see the structures on the floor. And on the floor of the upper part of the floor is this pons, and there is this swelling in the pons, which is called the facial colliculus. And down here we can see the floor being formed by the medulla. So this should sort of help you to understand how we are looking at the image, and it's very important for you to know that. So these are the various parts of the brainstem. Now another very important thing for you to know is that all of the cranial nerves, other than the first and second, but the rest from the third to the 12th, all of them arise from the ventral aspect of the brainstem. That is third to 12th. All arise from the ventral aspect of the brainstem except the fourth cranial nerve, which is the trochlear nerve. This fourth cranial nerve arises from the dorsal aspect of the brainstem. So this fourth cranial nerve arises from this aspect of the brainstem. So you will see it. It's a very slender nerve, often torn when you remove the brain. And this really hooks around the crus cerebri in this fashion. And when it hooks around, this is where we see it, which is why we say that it is lateral to the crus, whereas the third is medial to the crus. So this is important for you to remember, that the trochlear is the only nerve which arises on the dorsal aspect. All of the other cranial nerves arise on the ventral aspect of the brainstem. Let's now move on to the tracts, and really what I'm trying to show you here is that as we look at the, when we were doing the spinal cord and we wanted to describe the tracts, we showed how they were formed based on cross sections like this. So this was a cross section of the spinal cord, and we drew these cross sections and showed how these tracts were formed. Now as we go through the brainstem, what we are going to do is cut through different parts of the brainstem. So again, if this is the crus cerebri, that's the pons, and that's the medulla, we are going to be taking sections of these three areas at different levels. So we'll take, in the case of medulla, we make 3 sections, and one a little higher up here, Then in the case of the pons, we make 2 sections. And in the case of the midbrain also, we make 2 sections. So that's how we are going to look at the brainstem and look at all the tracts which we see over there. So now first thing I want you to realize is that all the ascending tracts which we formed in the spinal cord, and those ascending tracts were the dorsal columns. Then we formed the anterolateral system, which was the spinothalamic tracts, and then we formed, if you remember, the spinocerebellar tracts. So these were the tracts. Now these were formed at the level of the spinal cord. They had to go all the way, they were ascending, and they had to go all the way up into the brain, or in the case of the spinocerebellar, they had to go into the cerebellum. So as we go through these different sections of the brainstem, we are going to be seeing these same tracts. Some of them will change their names, so it will be the same tract but with a name change. For example, if you remember, the dorsal column we started calling it the medial lemniscus, and the anterolateral system we started calling it the spinal lemniscus. So we'll be seeing these tracts. Another thing we'll see is that the tracts begin to approach each other, and thirdly, they also retain their position. So if they were present on the lateral aspect when we saw them, they kind of still continue to be lateral. And then if at different levels any tract moves out, then we no longer see it. For example, the spinocerebellar tracts, the posterior spinocerebellar enters the cerebellum at the level of the medulla. So in the pons and the midbrain, we'll no longer see the posterior or dorsal spinocerebellar. But the anterior spinocerebellar enters the cerebellum through the midbrain. So we'll be seeing that tract all the way through. So that is important for you to understand how and why these tracts are mentioned when we are looking at the different parts of the brainstem. Now I haven't gone over the cranial nerves. I've given it to you in a tabulated form. What are the main functions of the cranial nerve? So that is something that you must know, and you must know those which have parasympathetic components. So now let's look here at the ascending tracts, and let's first start with the dorsal columns. So here we saw this is the dorsal columns. They entered the spinal cord and they traveled upward. So you can see these are the dorsal columns traveling up here. So the fasciculus, gracilis, and cuneatus. When they came into the medulla, at this point in the medulla, they synapse about the mid-level of medulla into the nucleus gracilis and cuneatus, cross over, and notice here then they form the medial lemniscus. So here at this point the image is really very small, so I can't show you, but I can't see the labeling, but this here is the medial lemniscus. This medial lemniscus, notice it's going through the this was at the level of the medulla, it's going through the pons, it goes through the pons, then it gets into the midbrain, and from here it will go to the thalamus. So you can see that you are going to find this tract all the way through because it has to go right up to the brain. The next one, the anterolateral system. So here in the anterolateral system, here we have the fibers coming in, they synapse, they cross over. Notice they form this spinothalamic tracts, anterior and lateral. We'll call it the anterolateral system. So it's still present in the medulla. And then once it enters the brainstem, it gets called spinal lemniscus. So you can see it's at the lateral part of the brainstem going up. As it travels up, you can notice how the medial lemniscus and spinal lemniscus come close to each other so that all the lemnisci travel then together towards the thalamus. Also, you have to remember that these two tracts were carrying sensations from the body. So if this is the face, that's the head and neck, and that's the limb, they were all carrying sensations. Both these tracts were carrying sensations from the body. And if you remember, the medial lemniscus was joined at the level of the brainstem. It's joined by a tract which is called which carries sensations from the face, and that tract forms and joins it, and that tract is called trigeminal lemniscus. So that's from the face the sensations pass up. And that there are some sensations for proprioception. Similarly, the spinal lemniscus is also joined by tracts which carry pain and temperature. So they'll do the same thing and they join it. And we'll see this, that will be called the trigeminal pathway, and we'll see this when we're doing that. But for now, just understand that both the medial lemniscus and the spinal lemniscus get joined by fibers which are bringing sensations from the face, and they travel together so that sensations from the entire body then will go towards the thalamus and then finally to the brain. Here what is not shown are the spinocerebellar tracts. So as these spinocerebellar tracts were, so this it's formed here. So this dorsal spinocerebellar tract will travel upwards like this, and then in the medulla, at the level of the medulla, through the inferior cerebellar peduncle, it'll go into the cerebellum. And thereafter, we won't see it. So this was the dorsal spinocerebellar tract. So thereafter, we don't see it. The anterior spinocerebellar, so if I use this, or let me use a different one. The anterior spinocerebellar, if you remember, it crossed over. So we will see this tract all along the entire brainstem at this point. We'll see this tract, and at the level of the midbrain, this tract crosses over, or excuse me, it's kind of recrosses and goes to the cerebellum of the same side, not this. So it recrosses and goes to the cerebellum of the same side. So this anterior spinocerebellar will be seen along the entire brainstem, whereas the dorsal spinocerebellar will remain only up to the medulla, because after that it's no longer present. So that's how you're going to look at the ascending tract. So what you've already formed, you're going to see most of them all the way up till we reach the brain, except for a few depending on where they go. Let's look at the descending tracts. So these descending tracts we had formed in the brain. So this was, formed in the brain. So the main ones that we mentioned were the corticospinal tracts or the corticonuclear. So as they traveled from the brain, they're traveling down, they travel down the internal capsule, and from the internal capsule they come and lie in the midbrain. Now in the midbrain, they lie, as you can see, so I want you to notice this and keep it in mind. So they are lying, if this is the dorsal aspect and this is the ventral aspect. The front is always the ventral aspect of any of these structures. So they always maintain this front or anterior position. So in the midbrain, notice they are lying in this part, and they lie actually in the crus cerebri. So that crus cerebri in the midbrain really carries these corticospinal and corticonuclear fibers. So from the crus cerebri, then they enter the pons, because after the midbrain you have the pons. So what happens in the pons is that in the pons, this whole big tract is really broken up, as you can see, into into little smaller tracts. The reason being, in the pons you have several nuclei present. You have several little nuclei which are interspersed, and they kind of break up this thick band into smaller little bands. So now these corticospinal fibers are broken up into smaller bands. So they travel through the pons in that fashion because of the presence of these pontine nuclei. And then they, again become one massive tract in the pyramid of the medulla. So in the upper medulla, they are traveling in the pyramid. Remember, I mentioned that we call them pyramidal fibers because of that. And then the pyramid, you have the decussation. So if you remember, these fibers crossed over, 80% crossed over. You can see they cross over, and then it's at this point that we really start calling them corticospinal fibers. Notice some of these are passing out and going to the cranial nerve nuclei. So these would be the corticonuclear fibers. So in the entire brainstem, many of them will peel out and go to the respective cranial nerve nuclei, and those will be the corticonuclear fibers. And those which have to go to the anterior horn of the spinal cord, those will cross as one big band, and we'll call them the corticospinal fibers. So you'll see these coming down. Apart from these, all those fibers which began from different nuclei. For example, this is the red nucleus of in the midbrain. Any fibers beginning from there will travel as little tracts, which we call rubrospinal. Now, I don't want you to remember their position in the different sections of the brainstem, and I don't mention them, but I just want you to know that as a tract is formed and it goes down, you will see it from then on depending on where it's formed. So if a tract is formed high up, you'll see it all the way down. If there's a tract formed here, for example, from the vestibular nucleus, then you won't see it up there because it only began from here. So then you'll see those fibers all the way down. So when we do these sections, this is how you're going to remember what tracts you see and what tracts you don't see. So now let's go to the next slide, where we are going to look at the first section that we make in the medulla. And let me just look here at this. So the sections we take in the medulla are 3 sections. We take one section which is at the point where these corticospinal fibers, or rather these pyramidal fibers which are coming down in the pyramid, they begin to cross at this level. So they cross at this level. So we take one section at this point where we call it the pyramidal decussation. The next section we take a little higher up, which is at the point where the nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus receive their fibers from the fasciculus gracilis and cuneatus, and those medial lemniscal fibers are formed. That means we are taking it, the next section is taken at this point here, where those medial lemniscal fibers are formed. And then the third section we take at a point where the medulla is actually, where you can see the olive really clearly. So, you can see the olive really clearly, and it is at this point where the central canal, posteriorly, the central canal has actually opened out and become the fourth ventricle. So you're really looking at the floor of the fourth ventricle too. So for the medulla, these are the 3 sections that we are taking. So let's look at the first section. And so when you look at your notes, you will notice that the 3 sections we are taking at the level of the pyramidal decussation, which is this one. Then we take the next section at the level of the sensory decussation, and third is at the level of the olives. So it's not shown here, but this is about where we take this third section, and that's at the level of the olive. Now I have tabulated it, and you can see that I show you a level. At that level, I show you what cavity you will see. So in the first 2, you'll still see the central canal going up. It's only in the third that the fourth ventricle is seen. Then I tell you the nuclei which you'll see, and I'll just explain that. Then I show you the descending and ascending tracts, or motor and sensory tracts. Now, what are these nuclei? Now, let me again use another page, and let me show it to you up here. Now here you can see that this part is the spinal cord, and let's say this is continuous with the medulla. This is the medulla. Now in the spinal cord, you can see it's a well-arranged H-shaped region of gray matter. Now as you approach the medulla, what happens is that this gray matter actually gets a little broken up. So instead of being a very well-defined H, in some parts you see somewhat of an H, you'll see something like this. And then this part of the H kind of gets broken up. Instead, you just see a little bit up here. And the reason being that some fibers are crossing over, so they break up the gray matter. So when they break up the gray matter, instead of being well organized like this, you kind of see it in little bits and pieces. As you go further up, this gray matter may be broken up even more. So, when you go further up, you will find that the gray matter now gets broken up, let's say where the fourth ventricle is formed. So if you're looking at the highest part of the medulla, now the fourth ventricle is formed. So that's the open part of the fourth ventricle, and that's just that little part here. So in other words, a section, suppose it's going through here. So this is the showing you the floor of the fourth ventricle. So here now the gray matter, instead of being arranged like this, because you don't have the central canal and you have very little nervous tissue here, the gray matter now gets broken up into little islands. So you'll see little islands of gray matter, and these islands will really correspond to the cranial nerve nuclei. And I'll explain what each part is, when you compare it to the spinal cord, what each part will be. So let's look at the first level, where the section is really taken from the lower part of the medulla, and let's see what all we expect to see. So this is showing you this image here is the posterior aspect of the medulla, and let me just go higher up here and notice that if you were to take a section at this part of the medulla, on the posterior aspect, of course, you'll see that fasciculus, gracilis, and cuneatus. So if you, or let me just go to the next image, maybe that might be a little clearer here. So here we had the 12th cranial nerve fibers this way. So if we take a section at this point going across like this, so you can see anteriorly what we will see is the pyramids. Then we have to see the origin of these 12 cranial nerves, and we'll see this inferior cerebellar peduncle. And posteriorly, you can see, we'll see the fasciculus cuneatus and fasciculus gracilis. So let's now look at that section. So here we are looking at that section. So this is ventral and this part is dorsal. So notice in the ventral, this area here is the pyramid. You don't see the olive particularly well because it's not formed at this level. So this is the lateral part of the medulla. And then when you go posteriorly, you see you see two tiny bulges. So you can say that this lateral bulge, it's not very clear, is the fasciculus cuneatus, and the medial bulge is fasciculus gracilis. Same thing coming down, and then you go all the way back. Now this gray matter is, as I mentioned earlier, is kind of broken up. It's not a typical H-shaped gray matter because these pyramidal fibers are crossing at this level. So they were crossing and they break that continuity of the gray matter. And so it still is, if you follow it, it still is somewhat of a gray, continuous, little bit like this, but not extremely well seen. Now let's see what are the nuclei we will see at this level. So the first, and I'm going to follow your notes. So the first one is nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus. So here it is, the nucleus gracilis and the nucleus cuneatus. And this nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus, so if you look at this, and I said it kind of looks a little bit like an H. So this was the H of the central canal. And that's the central canal. This was the posterior horn and this is the anterior horn. So this nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus collectively are like the posterior horn cells. And that, if you think of it logically, what happens? The fasciculus gracilis comes and synapses over here, and the fasciculus cuneatus will come and synapse. They do it a little higher up, and then these fibers pass over and become the medial lemniscus. So these were sensory fibers, and if you remember, the sensory fibers come and synapse in the posterior horn, like those which form the spinothalamic tract. So these nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus are like the posterior or dorsal horn cells of the spinal cord. In other words, they receive sensory fibers. And what do they receive? The fasciculus gracilis, and this one will receive fasciculus cuneatus. Now again, let's look at this and we move further anteriorly. So when we are moving further anteriorly, we see the ventral or anterior horn cells. Now that has been broken up, and these anterior horn cells, what did they give rise to? They gave rise to the motor fibers of the spinal nerves. But now this is the brainstem. So at the level of the brainstem, it will be the cranial nerve, the motor fibers of the cranial nerves which will come out. And at this level, if you remember, which is the cranial nerve that I said was present? And just to refresh your memory, up here, I told you this was the 12th which was coming out. So if you take a section over here like this, you will see the cranial nerve 12th, the cells giving rise to the 12th cranial nerve. And another thing that you must remember is, like, unlike the spinal nerves, which had both sensory and motor fibers, the cranial nerves are not necessarily always having mixed fibers. The 12th is one of them which is considered totally motor. So therefore you see fibers, or you see cells present here which give rise to the 12th cranial nerve. So if you it's not seen here rather well, only because actually I've shown it at a higher level. So I'm going to draw it for you. So somewhere up here, let's say somewhere up here will be fibers, will be cells which will give rise to the 12th cranial nerve. So these cells give rise to the 12th cranial nerve, and that's why I have it in asterisks. So this image didn't show you the 12th nerve because it depends. If for example you take the, let me just go back here. So you can see that these are the 12th nerve fibers which are present here. So if you took the section a little lower down up here, you might miss the 12th nerve. So if you took it a little higher up, you will get the 12th nerve. So that's why I have it in asterisks in your notes, just to show you that you expect to now start finding the 12th cranial nerve. You also expect to see the spinal root of the accessory nerve, which is the 11th cranial nerve, and you see that because that is going up from the spinal cord. So again, to go back here, so if you look here at this image, this is the 11th cranial nerve. These fibers which are present here are from the medulla, but then there are these lower fibers which are coming from the spinal cord. So from the spinal cord, these fibers travel up like this to form the accessory nerve. So when you take a section through the lower part of the medulla, you're still getting these the spinal part of the accessory nerve. So that's what is being shown here. So here in this image, you can see the spinal root of the accessory. Again, this is a motor nerve nucleus, so it will be equivalent to the ventral horn cells. So just as I had drawn the 12th up here, so these will be the 12th also. These cells are equivalent to the anterior horn cells because those are motor. Same with the spinal root of the accessory, that also is equivalent to the anterior horn cell. So that's what you will see at this point. Now another addition of the nucleus is the nucleus of the trigeminal nerve. So what you see here is that if you remember the dorsal horn in the spinal cord, that received fibers for pain and temperature for the entire body, and also crude touch. Now from the face, the trigeminal nerve is the one which is carrying sensations, and the trigeminal nerve also needs a place to relay in. So it needs something like the dorsal horn cells. So just as we had this nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus equivalent to the dorsal horn cells, the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal, because now we are in the brainstem and where the trigeminal nerve is now going to bring in fibers. So we have this spinal nucleus of the trigeminal nerve begins to start showing up. And again, just to explain to you, let me go back to my page and open a new page. And what I'm really trying to tell you is that if this is the brainstem and this is the spinal cord, and I'm cutting it like this just to show you that if I was to draw the spinal cord at this level, okay, show you a cut portion of the spinal cord. Now here is the gray matter. So these dorsal horn cells, these are the ones which receive sensory impulses for pain and temperature, which went on like that. and the spinocerebellar, they went back on the same place. Of course, the dorsal columns, they didn't relay here, but they went up. Now, when you come to the brainstem, you're not going to have any spinal nerves. But for the face area, all the sensations of the face are carried by the fifth cranial nerve. The sensation. So this is all carried by the fifth cranial nerve. So from all of this area, you have the fifth cranial nerve. This fifth cranial nerve is related to the pons. So if I said that was midbrain, that was pons, and that was the medulla, this is related here. So fibers enter here. But what happens is that the cells on which they'll relay, these cells are really present in an entire band like this, and we'll see that in the trigeminal system, and these have been given different names. So this is really a bunch of cells collected together in the brainstem. They are equivalent to the dorsal horn cells, and they're given different names, and I'm just going to introduce the names. In the midbrain, this bunch of cells is known as the mesencephalic nucleus. I will do it again when we do the trigeminal system. In the pons, this is known as the sensory nucleus, and in the medulla, this is known as the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal. What are these really? These are really cells which have been collected together. So these are cells collected together in this area. So the spinal nucleus is basically a bunch of cells collected together, and we just show it as one mass like this. So fibers from the face, so again if I draw the face like this, fibers from the face come in. So those fibers which carry, let me just say fibers carry pain and temperature, they come in. They have their cell body in a ganglion which is known as the trigeminal ganglion. They enter at the pons because that's where the fifth is related. They travel down all the way, and when they are traveling down, they form a tract which is known as the spinal tract of the trigeminal, and then they come and relay on these cells. So they'll come and relay on these cells. Now the second order neuron will actually cross and go up, and there it will join that spinal lemniscus and go up. So this is for pain and temperature. And again, I'm just giving you this just as an idea. Some of these fibers which have to relay here don't have to travel down. They'll just go this way. Others will have to go up to the midbrain. So as they do this, they form a system which is called the trigeminal system, which we'll do again a little bit in the next presentation. So here in the medulla, what you're going to see is you're going to see this nucleus which is equal to the dorsal horn, and you're going to see those fibers which are going to synapse on this nucleus, and we call that the spinal tract of the trigeminal. So we go back, that's what you're seeing. The nucleus is the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal. This is equivalent to the posterior horn cell. So it is to receive fibers, and it is surrounded by these axons which form the spinal tract of the trigeminal. So these will actually come and synapse here on that. And so you can see that that's what is present on both sides. So the nuclei which will be seen at this level are the nucleus gracilis, the nucleus cuneatus, the spinal nucleus. You can see all of these on the posterior aspect, so they are equal to the posterior horn cells. And then as we go anteriorly, we have the nucleus of the spinal root of the accessory and the nucleus of the hypoglossal. These two are like the anterior horn cells. What are the motor tracts which you see here? It is these pyramidal tracts which are now at this point. This is the point where it is decussating. So this is really showing you the pyramidal decussation. And as they decussate, they now form the lateral corticospinal tract. Some which don't decussate and remain on the same side will form the anterior corticospinal tract. So that is the motor tract you see. Again, just to explain to you, it's at this figure, the section has been taken at this point here. So you can see it's been taken at this point here where it's showing you these pyramidal tracts decussating. So that's what is happening. So that's where this section has been taken. So those are the motor tracts. Now let's look at the sensory tracts. So we'll go from posterior. So we have the dorsal columns present because they were traveling up. So what are those dorsal columns? We have the fasciculus gracilis and the fasciculus cuneatus. If you want, you can just divide it like this, just so that it shows you this part is the gracilis, this area here is the cuneatus. Then we have the anterolateral system, which is the anterior and lateral spinothalamic tract. If you remember, that was present laterally, and that's what this is showing you. So that's here, this one here, that's the anterolateral system. Then we have the spinocerebellar tracts. Remember, they were present on the lateral aspect. So we have the posterior and the anterior spinocerebellar. This is the posterior, that's the anterior spinocerebellar. These were all in the spinal cord and they are just going up. The only addition that we have here at this point is the spinal tract of the trigeminal, because as I showed you from that image, this was where it was being formed. So here, so this is where it's being formed at this point, because here it was not present in the spinal cord, but it was in the brainstem that this tract is formed, and that's why we begin to see it at the level of the brainstem. So that is the pyramidal decussation. Let's look at the next level now, which is the sensory decussation. Now you can see that what happens is that the central canal begins to move a little bit further posteriorly, and at the same time, again, this gray matter now is broken up into, it becomes more piecemeal, because now you have the sensory decussation occurring at this level. So at this level, what you see, you still see the central canal, and let us see all the nuclei that you see. You see the nucleus gracilis, you see the nucleus cuneatus. This is where the relay is going to be occurring, so you'll see it all the way. You see it, some of you may wonder that at the lower level, which is this, at the lowest level, why are we still seeing the nucleus gracilis and nucleus cuneatus if the relay occurred higher up? You see, relay doesn't occur at one point and stop, and it's not as if the nucleus is only present here. The nucleus is kind of a long nucleus this way, present over a good length of the medulla. So the fibers will keep synapsing here. The fibers will synapse here too. So when I took it at the first section at this level, which is here, it isn't to say that there is no synapse occurring. The synapse is still occurring. Some of the fibers will still cross over and form the medial lemniscus, but the main thing that's happening at this level is the sensory decussation, so that's why we don't mention the medial lemniscus. When we take a section at this higher level, that's the main thing that is happening, which is motor decussation, so that's what we mention. So up here you can see the nucleus gracilis and cuneatus. Then let's look at the other nuclei. We see the spinal tract, because that is present. Remember, I said it was present from the midbrain up to the pons. You see a nucleus of the trigeminal. At this level, it's called the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal. So nucleus gracilis, nucleus cuneatus, spinal nucleus. The accessory nucleus is here, so we see that. This is still called the spinal root of the accessory. And now at this point, this image shows you the hypoglossal, and I had drawn it for you there. So you can see that these two would be like the anterior horn, because this would be like this. But because of the crossing over, this part gets broken up, and you just see it as islands here. So this one here would be for the hypoglossal, and this here for the spinal nucleus. You can see a little bit of the olivary nucleus, depending on what level it is being cut at. You can see the beginning of the olivary nucleus, the inferior olivary nucleus. And when we do the next one, I'll tell you the importance of this inferior olivary nucleus. Let's see the motor tracts at this level. Here you see the pyramids, which are the ones which contain the corticospinal and the corticonuclear. Remember, I said they maintained an anterior position. So this is where you're seeing the motor tracts. The sensory tracts, at this level, what you have is the fasciculus gracilis and cuneatus. Remember, we are going up, so we are at this point. the fasciculus, gracilis, and cuneatus, they relay, and then the fibers cross over, and you have the formation of the medial lemniscus. So now the medial lemniscal tract is being formed. So higher up, as we start going up like this, we'll be calling it the medial lemniscus. And so we see the medial lemniscus, we see the fasciculus, gracilis, and cuneatus. Then we see the anterolateral system, we see the spinocerebellar tracts, so we see these, and at this we also see the spinal tract of the trigeminal. So pretty similar to what we saw lower down. The only difference being at this level is that the sensory decussation was occurring and there were no corticospinal tracts, truly speaking. Instead they are in the pyramid, because that occurred, the decussation and formation occurred lower down. So in other words, that if we look at the front, if you're looking at the ventral aspect, if that's the olive and that's the cerebellar peduncle, this is the pyramid at this level, and it's only here that they cross over. So this was what we looked at A, and now we are cutting here at this level. So it's only, we only see it as the pyramid, which is here. You can ignore all of these, the medial longitudinal fasciculus, and somewhere else you might see something else which I have not mentioned, so you can ignore those. But the others which I'm mentioning, for example, this internal arcuate fibers, you can ignore that. These are nothing but where the crossing occurs, that's called the internal arcuate fibers. So this is the sensory decussation of at the second level in the medulla. Let's go to the third level, and here now we are cutting higher up in the medulla, where now the central canal has actually opened out and become the fourth ventricle. So that's what we see. So this is the fourth ventricle, and remember there's just a thin rim of nervous tissue over it, so that's why we see the floor of the fourth ventricle formed by the upper part of the medulla, and actually sitting over it here in the roof would be the cerebellum, but I'm going to erase that because we don't want to complicate the issue. Now the gray matter, because remember you have the gray matter has to be at the bottom of the fourth ventricle, because the central canal is opened out. So here the gray matter is really present as little islands, and at this point let us look at what are the nuclei we are going to see. The cavity is the cavity of the fourth ventricle. The section is at the level of the olive, and so we see the olivary nucleus really well at this level. And so let's see what are the other nuclei that we see. So we see the inferior olivary nucleus. We see the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal. And let me see where that is here. This over here, the spinal tract and nucleus of the trigeminal. We are looking at the hypoglossal, which is this one. The medial most is hypoglossal, remember, because it takes origin between, this part is the pyramid and this area here is the olive. So you can see this is the olive, this is the pyramid. So the hypoglossal emerged between the pyramid and the olive. But the nucleus now has moved up because the central canal is opened up. So here you can see the nucleus of the hypoglossal nerve. Then we see the nucleus of the vagus. So here we see the nucleus of the vagus, because at that point the 10th cranial nerve also comes out, and that's known as the dorsal nucleus of the vagus. And we see another nucleus which is really a combination of the 9th, 10th and 11th. So this nucleus is known as the nucleus ambiguus, and it gives rise to fibers. So you'll see this nucleus ambiguus a little higher up also. It gives rise to fibers of the 9th, 10th and 11th, and it is meant for supply of the muscles of the pharynx and larynx. So this is the nucleus ambiguus, which is the motor part of the 9th, 10th and 11th, giving rise to, and it supplies muscles of pharynx and larynx. So what then is this dorsal nucleus of the vagus? This dorsal nucleus of the vagus is, if you remember, the parasympathetic nervous system was related to 4 cranial nerves. The third, fourth, the third, not fourth, I apologize, the third, seventh, ninth, and 10th. That part of the parasympathetic which is related to the 10th, it forms a separate nucleus which is known as this dorsal nucleus of the vagus. So this dorsal nucleus of the vagus is the parasympathetic component which travels with the vagus. So here is the dorsal nucleus of the vagus. Here is the nucleus ambiguus. So you can see that, as the axons pass out, they go in the vagus, in the 10th cranial nerve. At this level, you also see, I said the parasympathetic goes with the 3rd, 7th, 9th, and 10th. With the 9th, you also see what is called the inferior salivatory nucleus. This is the inferior salivatory nucleus for supply of the parotid gland. So the parasympathetic, the part that goes with the vagus, has this dorsal nucleus of the vagus. The part that goes with the 9th cranial nerve forms this inferior salivatory nucleus, which is this red part which I have drawn. So that's this red area here is the inferior salivatory nucleus, and that will travel out. The axons will travel out and go with the 9th, as will fibers from the nucleus ambiguus also go with the 9th. So imagine if we have well, I think the next slide shows that, so I won't go over that. So at this level, you see the inferior salivatory nucleus, which is the parasympathetic component of 9th for supply of the parotid gland. The dorsal nucleus is the parasympathetic component which travels with the 10th, and it goes to supply glands in the gastrointestinal tract. And then we also see at this point, we see the vestibular and the cochlear nuclei. So here we are looking at the vestibular and the cochlear nuclei, and this is for hearing. At this point, we see the vestibular and cochlear nuclei because this is the pontomedullary junction, and these vestibular and cochlear nuclei are concerned with the 8th. They are in relation to the 8th cranial nerve. So this at the pontomedullary junction, we see the 8th cranial nerve. So these two belong to that. And when we look at the lower level of the pons, we'll see these again. Then we also see in this picture, notice the inferior cerebellar peduncle, because we are taking this level high up. This is where the inferior cerebellar peduncle connects the medulla to the cerebellum. So we see the inferior cerebellar peduncle at this point. Let's look at the function of the inferior olivary nucleus. This gets impulses from the cerebral cortex, and it gets impulses from the spinal cord. Having got impulses from both higher centers in the cortex and from centers in the spinal cord, this now has a reciprocal communication with the cerebellum. So therefore, all the input from these two regions goes to the cerebellum, and then the cerebellum sends the information back to the inferior olivary nucleus for it to send impulses back to the spinal cord or to the cerebral cortex, as the case may be. And the function is, this is associated with voluntary muscle movement. So if there is any change that needs to be made, this can be made by the cortex or by the spinal cord. So that's the function of the inferior olivary nucleus. Now let me go to the next slide, and just to explain that nucleus ambiguus. And also there was another nucleus that I actually did forget to mention here, which was also called the nucleus of the Tractus solitarius, and that's this nucleus here, very important nucleus. This is called the nucleus of the Tractus solitarius. This nucleus is for taste. So it's a sensory nucleus, and it receives fibers from the 7th, 9th, and 10th. These go up here. These three actually form a tract, and that tract is called Tractus solitarius, and they carry the fibers to the nucleus solitarius, and they are carrying sensations of taste from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, that is 7th, From the posterior 1/3 is the 9th, and the posterior most part of the tongue is the 10th. So they carry impulses to this nucleus solitarius. So let us look at this in a little more detail and go to the next slide. And first I'm going to explain that nucleus ambiguus. The nucleus ambiguus is a motor component that belongs to the 9th to 11th cranial nerve. So you can see this. This is the nucleus ambiguus. It is in line with the anterior gray horn. So you can see the anterior gray horn was motor. So here you can see how it is connected to the 9th. Here is connected to the 9th, to the 10th, and to the 11th. So the fibers from here, these are the motor cells. So they'll have corticonuclear fibers which will come and relay on them. And then these cells will give rise to axons which will pass out in the 9th, 10th, and 11th cranial nerves. And they will go to supply muscles of the pharynx and the larynx. So at different levels, if it is at a lower level, it will go to, if the section on the medulla is at a lowermost level, it will be the 11th, a little higher up, it will be the 10th, and a little higher up, it will be the 9th. So that's what the nucleus ambiguus does. And then here is that solitary nucleus that I was mentioning. This is a sensory nucleus for taste. So information is going to it, doesn't exit from it. So that information is through the 7th, through the 9th, and through the 10th. So if I take the tongue like this, ignore all of these others. So this is the anterior part of the tongue, and this is the posterior most part of the tongue. Let me say that's the epiglottis. So from the anterior 2/3 of the tongue, the impulses will pass with the 7th cranial nerve. It will have its cell body in a ganglion of the 7th cranial nerve, which is called the geniculate ganglion. Then the fibers pass into the medulla, synapse there, and then from there, the second order neurons will pass up. They'll go to the thalamus. This is an uncrossed tract. This is a special sensation, an uncrossed tract. And from the thalamus, it goes and relays in the parietal lobe of the brain, because that's where all sensations are perceived. Then from the posterior 1/3 of the tongue, the impulses pass out in the 9th cranial nerve. They have their cell bodies in a sensory ganglion of the 9th. They enter the solitary nucleus, synapse, and do the same thing. And from the posterior most part of the tongue and this adjacent area of the epiglottis, the sensations pass into the 10th cranial nerve. Their cell bodies are in the sensory nucleus of the 10th. Like all of these are like the dorsal root ganglia. And then the fibers pass in, synapse, and then go the same way. All of these other, you can see that they are crossing over some fibers, synapse in the reticular formation, and from the reticular formation, fibers come down as the reticulospinal or reticular bulbar tracts. So this, you can, ignore this other part, but this is how taste is finally carried to the sensory cortex of the brain. Now, I intended to do this in just 2 portions, but I think it's rather long, so I'm going to stop here and then do the pons and midbrain separately, and then I will do the trigeminal and the auditory pathways separately.